In this new installment of our Meet the Author series, Nadia will discuss religious residue, the impact of childhood religious socialization on the religiosity of nuns in France, Germany, and Great Britain, and British Journal of Sociology, 2022. Nadia Beider is a postdoctoral fellow at the Social Research Institute, University College London. Her research focuses on change broadly defined, include denominational switching, conversion, and disaffiliation, tracing the motivation for such shifts and their sociological and demographic implications. So I will leave the floor to you, and after that we will have a moment for Q&A, and I will be moderating those. So I want to thank you again for being here, please.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me to come here. I'm really happy to be here. So I'm going to share my screen now, and I'm going to be talking about religious residue. And really, this research was born out of two main lines of inquiry. So I'm interested in religious change, as Guada said. And when I started looking at the literature on religious change, I found there was a huge amount of focus on why people change religion and how that process comes about, but a lot less interest in what happens afterwards. And sometimes even some quite strong assumptions about what happens afterwards, right? So there were some sociologists who, for instance, would argue that people who've joined a religion can only be defined as converts if they are, for instance, more religious than the average. But I worked a little bit on immigration, and so I was aware that even after some kind of big identity transition, people adopt quite different approaches, strategies, behaviors, and that things aren't really as simple as moving from one to another and changing very much from one to another. Really, there's a range of responses that we see in the way people act after these identity changes. And I started looking at other approaches to what happens after identity change. And my thinking was very much shaped by Helen Rose Ebor's book, Becoming an X, where she really looks at what happens after identity transitions, not only religious ones, but other things, for instance, mothers who lose custody of their children, and people who are ex-police officers, and all these kind of things, and really kind of trying to trace what happens after religious change. And then the other really big question that led me to this research is, of course, secularization on a societal level. So luckily in this audience, I don't need to convince anybody that, people are becoming more secular. There's a decline in religious affiliation in Western countries. Outside of these kind of settings, though, sometimes you do meet maybe skepticism or people who think that, this isn't really an appropriate theory. And so I wanted to really look into the data a little bit in these countries and kind of tease out what's really happening in terms of secularization. So, as we all know, one of the big shifts in religion in the past several decades is what we call the rise of the nuns, right? The people who have no religious affiliation. We can see in these European countries, there's a really striking increase, and part of that is driven by an increase in disaffiliation, but also what we're seeing is a maybe sharper increase, certainly in the last decade shown here, in people who are lifelong nuns. That is, people who were raised without a religion and continue to not be identified with any religious tradition. And I think one of the things that we need to think about when we talk about religious nuns is that one of the puzzling things about them is this kind of heterogeneity of religiosity among nuns. So although the one thing they have in common is that they all are not affiliated with any religious group, beyond that, it's a little bit harder to talk about what they have in common. It's certainly not the case that they are all committed atheists, that none of them ever prays or, does anything religious. That's definitely not what's going on. And so then it's really a bit of a puzzle why some of them, do have some religious practices or do hold some religious beliefs, even though they identify as not belonging to a religious movement. And so once when, the population of the unaffiliated nuns was pretty small, there was a tendency in the literature to kind of lump them together and they'd be the reference category. And there wasn't a lot of interest at trying to really understand what's going on within this group. But then as they became bigger and people became more interested, there were some attempts to really try and unpick the heterogeneity that we find. So I think one really fruitful way of doing this is to divide the nons into subcategories. And I think certainly as they're getting bigger, it's almost impossible not to, right? You can't take such a big group of people and kind of put them all in one single category and expect that to be useful analytically. So one approach is to divide nons on the basis of belief. So for instance, atheists, agnostics, and people who say they're nothing in particular, right? And we know when it comes to, for instance, political orientation, atheists and agnostics are much more likely to be kind of liberal, left-leaning, but nothing in particular, not so much. So there are some really important distinctions here, and by dividing the nons into smaller subgroups, we can really get at them. Another approach is to divide them in terms of spirituality. So we have this group called the SBNRs, it's a bit of a mouthful, the spiritual but not religious, right? So people might not identify with a religious group or with a religion, but they might still be spiritual. And then we have people who are not spiritual and not religious, right? We have all these different possibilities. And while I think these are really helpful categories and a big step forward from looking at the nons as one big group, they do help highlight some of the differences among nons, but they don't really help us to explain why nons are different. So it's true, nons who are atheists, agnostics are different from those who are nothing in particular, who might believe. But where's that coming from? And so I think maybe a more useful way of looking at the nons is to think about the role of childhood religious socialization. Now, we know that religious socialization in childhood is one of the strongest predictors of adult religious behavior. And this is also true for people who change their religious affiliation. It's not only for those people who stay in the religious group in which they were raised. So for instance, research has shown that in the Brexit vote in the UK, people who were raised Anglican, Church of England, and have since disaffiliated, they are now nons, their voting patterns were somewhere between those of Anglicans and nuns, right? So Anglicans were more likely to vote Remain and nuns were more likely to vote Leave, and nuns were more likely to vote Remain. And so even things that aren't actually religious, they're just sort of associated with religion. Even among disaffiliates, we see different patterns than we do among lifelong nuns, because some of this childhood religious socialization stays with people. It has an impact, no matter what they go on to do later in life, no matter how they change their religious identity. And so this was something I really wanted to explore here in terms of religiosity. So my first question is, do lifelong nuns and disaffiliates differ significantly in terms of religiosity? Is it the case that there's this tremendous break with the past, a radical rejection of everything that came before, a wholesale transformation of self, right? So people who were religious and have exited have gone to the other extreme, as some people have argued, or like I've been suggesting, maybe there's this religious residue effect, that childhood religious socialization leaves some kind of imprint, some kind of mark, even on people who've disaffiliated. So that's the first question I want to look into. The second question I want to look into is, what is the impact of country of residence, right? So are there inter-country variations? So for instance, we have all these different theories about how religion works in different countries, right? So we have this idea in England, for instance, of believing without belonging, or we have in, say, Scandinavia, the idea of belonging without believing. So we have different models of how religion works. So how does that affect the religiosity of nuns in these different contexts? Some would argue in Catholic countries, nuns are particularly secular because there's quite a lot of social pressure to stay affiliated, even if you're not very religious. So maybe we see different things there in, majority Catholic or Catholic heritage countries. So I wanted to kind of look at a few countries and see what I could see there. The third thing I wanted to check, I mentioned the secularization thesis, so I wanted to know what happens over time, right? Does religiosity among nuns change over time? We know what happens on a societal level, but what happens within this group and why? And then finally, in order to test secularization, I also wanted to go a bit further. So we know that secularization thesis posits a decline in religiosity, but there are other options. So for instance, individualization thesis, that argues that organized traditional forms of religion are in decline, but that people are maybe exiting organized religion, but they're not letting go of religion altogether, but maybe expressing it in new ways. So not in traditional ways that we would expect, like attendance and prayer, but maybe more individualized and particularly maybe more spiritual forms of religion. So I wanted to kind of test that as well. So in order to test all of this, I used data from the International Social Survey Programme religion modules, looking at nones in Europe. And I used the religion modules 2 to 4, so that's 1998, 2008, and 2018. I restricted my research to nones in 4 countries, France, Germany, Great Britain, and Sweden, primarily because, as we know, lifelong nones weren't too commonly found back in 1998. So these are the countries where I had a sufficient number of lifelong nones, even back in 1998, in order to make my analysis robust, and I've still got a sample size of nearly 7,000 people. And then I ran regressions and I controlled for, socio-demographic variables, but also there was a very useful indicator of religiosity in childhood, which was church attendance aged 11. The dependent variables here, I wanted to look at different facets of religion to see if there's a difference between them. So there's an indicator of belief in God, a behavior, prayer, a kind of more holistic measure, self-reported religiosity. And then I also wanted an indicator of spirituality. So I chose belief in life after death, following Ammerman's understanding that spirituality is understood as something transcendent and immanent, but also could be something that's part of religion, but could be something that's part of non-religion, right? So I didn't want to choose the indicators that were very much associated with New Age religion, very much not associated with traditional religions. I wanted something that sort of could belong in both worlds. So, having looked at all of this, I found that if you can see from these predicted probabilities, you can see that the 1 here represents the most secular position, I guess. 0 is the most religious position. And consistently, so it's the most striking finding, these green bars, these lifelong nones, are less religious, more secular than disaffiliates. And we're going to go into some of the more other findings as well. So, like I said, this very consistent finding, no matter what indicator of religiosity, no matter what country, consistently disaffiliates were more religious, came out more religious in this research than lifelong nones. But I wanted to look at different indicators of religiosity. The gap was very big when it came to things like prayer and belief in God. When it came to spirituality, though, the gap between lifelong nones and disaffiliates was really not half as big. And so I want to look a little bit more deeply into what's going on with traditional indicators of religion and spirituality and really tease out what's going on here. So I've taken here, considering yourself to be a religious person as the indicator of traditional religion. I could have picked prayer, frequency of prayer or belief in God. You would have got exactly the same picture. So you can see these purple lines, very clear, trends over time, secularization, no doubt. Obviously a much steeper decline for disaffiliates because they're starting from a much higher point. Lifelong nones obviously starting from a much lower base. Like we said, this big gap between disaffiliates, that's the dark purple, and lifelong nones in the kind of pinky purple at the bottom. Really this big gap that really very much demonstrates this idea of religious residue. But when we look at belief in life after death, in the green lines, we see a completely different thing. Firstly, the gap is much smaller between lifelong nones and disaffiliates, and it's shrinking over time. Look, in 2018, they're very, very close. The other thing is that although there's a decline in belief in life after death among disaffiliates, there's actually a slight increase among lifelong nones. And this suggests that there is definitely a different development going on when we look at indicators of spirituality, among nones at least, relative to indicators of traditional religion. And so maybe we can say that spirituality among nones is holding stable. I think some of the bolder claims of the individualization thesis that spirituality will kind of replace religion, that people are exiting religion and switching to spirituality, I don't think that's supported. But I think there is something different going on with spirituality, and we aren't seeing this kind of decline in spirituality that we see in traditional religion. It's kind of holding steady among nones. So not full wholehearted support for individualization thesis, but definitely some support, some notion that there's something very different and it is kind of maintaining its place. Now, the other thing that I found really interesting was that in Britain, France, and Sweden, the gaps between disaffiliates and lifelong nuns were fairly similar. But when it came to Germany, the gaps between disaffiliates and lifelong nuns were much, much bigger. I would argue that this is due to the very specific history of religion in Germany. Now, the important thing to note here is that the division between East and West Germany and the rapid secularization that East Germans underwent made the religious landscape in East and West Germany completely different. So in 2000, for instance, a survey showed that only a quarter of the population of the former East Germany, the GDR, were church members, compared to about 80% of those in West Germany. In addition, we could see that this goes back a long way. So if we look at how people were raised, if we look at people in Eastern Germany, those born in the 1940s, almost none of them would say they were raised without a religion. They were all raised, in a religious tradition. But when you come to the cohort born in the 1950s, a third of them say that they were raised without a religion, so they're lifelong nuns. Most of them stayed non-religious. And of the cohort born in the 1960s, fully over 3/4 of them said they were raised without a religion. So what we see in East Germany is, rapid secularization. And then in the survey now, what we see is that the vast majority of lifelong nuns are coming from East Germany in the German sample, whereas the disaffiliates are spread more evenly and much more likely to be in West Germany relative to lifelong nuns. And so I can't totally control for it. So I did kind of split Germany into different sections and look, but there has also been migration between, since reunification. So I couldn't totally control for this, but, splitting the regions of Germany indicates that, this is very much so. And also what I've just said about historical trends. Now, being a lifelong nun in East Germany is very different from being a lifelong nun elsewhere because of the early secularization. So one of the things I found, I looked at an indicator of religiosity in childhood, right? So frequency of church attendance, 11 to 12. Now, across the board, people who were raised more religious as children, who attended church more often, the religious residue, the likelihood that they were more religious as disaffiliates was stronger, right? So the more intense the religious socialization received in childhood, the greater the religious residue. That's very clear. The disaffiliates who are raised in more religious homes are more religious even when they're nuns. Now in Germany, what we're talking about is a completely different environment, right? So people who were raised in East Germany, compared to all the other countries that I'm looking at, grew up in a much more secular environment. They were much less likely to have been raised in a religious environment. The lifelong nuns in East Germany are often not just first generation lifelong nuns, we're talking about second generation lifelong nuns. That means they don't have parental secularization, religious socialization, sorry. They don't even have grandparental religious socialization. The society is so secularized, they don't have, all the other sources of religious socialization that we think of are just not part of their lives. The aggregate level of religiosity in society is much lower than we're seeing in other societies at the same time. And so what we see is this big gap between these lifelong nuns, often second generation lifelong nuns who grew up in East Germany, who are much less religious than lifelong nuns in other places. And so we see this huge gap between lifelong nuns and disaffiliates in Germany. Now, what I think is really interesting about this is that maybe it gives us an indication of future trends in other countries, right? Because East Germany secularized very early, so it's further along the process than other countries. But what we see is this kind of generational shift, right? So Christians are religious. Some of those people disaffiliate. They were raised as Christians. They become nuns. They're on average more religious than, lifelong nuns, which is kind of the next generation, right? There's disaffiliates who raise their children without a religion and they stay without religion. And then even less religious, we get to the second generation lifelong nuns. And so what we see here is a real shift and a decline in religiosity over the generations. But the other thing we can think about is that there's a kind of snowball effect. So if we think about lifelong nuns as a group, if we go back a couple of decades, most of them were disaffiliate and a minority were lifelong nuns, like we saw in the graph at the beginning. But the proportion of lifelong nuns within the nuns is increasing. And over time, it's likely that the proportion of second generation lifelong nuns will increase. And so the nuns as a group will become less and less religious, right? We're seeing this kind of shift. And then if we take a step back and we look at society in general, we see, you know, the nuns are a bigger group and they're less religious and they're becoming less. So this kind of effect is a kind of a cycle, and it maybe points us in a direction of where we might expect other countries to go. So I think Germany is a really interesting case study for what we might see in future years in other European societies that are kind of on the similar trajectory, maybe not imposed by the state, but this kind of move towards away from religion. And so kind of East Germany is giving us a little window into what we might see in the future in other European or Western countries. So in conclusion, I would say that the most striking finding is that we definitely see very clear and consistent evidence across the cases of religious residue. We find that disaffiliates are more religious than lifelong nuns, and that the more intense the childhood religious socialization, so if they, you know, went to church regularly, then the greater the residue. So very much supporting this notion that the way a child is raised has a huge impact on their religious behavior, beliefs, attitudes, all the way through adulthood, no matter whether they stay in that religion or not, right? Even when they change religion, they leave organized religion, this effect remains. And so this goes some way to explaining our initial puzzle. Why is it that nuns have this very quite broad range of religious behavior, and it's quite, you know, counterintuitive maybe for some people? Why is it these people who say they don't have religion are still doing these religious things? So I think maybe part of the answer is, well, it's something that stayed with them from childhood, and you know, the ones who weren't raised in a religion are much less likely to have that effect. And then finally, if we're talking more broadly, then we can see that this example of this kind of snowball effect that brings about secularization, and that the lack of socialization into religion, and then the lack of socialization even from like grandparents and so on, really kind of is drawing this path, not only that people are leaving religion, but, you know, as they go down the generations, this vestige, this residue of religion is really kind of disappearing among the nuns. So we're seeing a real shift there. But I would say that individualization thesis is partially supported. So even though society is very much secularizing, we do see that there is a slightly different mechanism underway when it comes to spirituality, and that is something that people are not abandoning in the same way. So certainly support for secularization thesis, no surprise, but still need to kind of look out and see what's happening when we talk about spirituality, and not to lump all those kind of aspects of religion together. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nadia, for that. It was super, super interesting. I see a lot of hands clapping. So now we open the Q&A section. You can either raise your hand, as I see Sarah already. Thanks for that, Sarah. Or you can write the question in the chat and I will read it for you. So please go ahead and let's start the discussion. Sarah.
Thank you. Thanks, Nadia. Really interesting presentation. A lot of the same findings and conclusions I've come to with my own work. So great to see that validated in other countries. And okay, so I got two questions. So you decide if you want to answer both or pick one. So one, because we're seeing different trends with that belief in the afterlife, is it time to start measuring different types of belief in afterlife? Because it is often that kind of outlier belief variable. And so what are your thoughts on that? Because some of beliefs in afterlife are closer to science. I'm not going to say scientific. And some are really, really closer to supernatural, transcendent, religious, right? So that's my first question. Second question is kind of following up on your conclusion is, so what do you think those mechanisms of socialization into spirituality are? So if it's something different, right, than religious socialization, which I do think it is as well, where are people picking that up? And I'm guessing it's also in childhood, and it's you know, sociologists, we believe in socialization, that's our main argument, but where are those main agents? Where do you think that's mainly coming from? I know you don't necessarily have evidence for this, but kind of just theorize at this point. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much. Yes, I always think it's good if people are finding the same things in their research, then you kind of think, okay, good. What I'm working on makes sense. So I think, yes, you're absolutely right about these questions about the afterlife. I think they are so broad and mean so many different things to different people. And I think it would be great if we could really drill down into what those mean, because I think there's a few things going on. There's, like you say, a more rational kind of understanding. There's a more traditional religious understanding, but there's also a more modern understanding, maybe like maybe New Age, maybe sort of Buddhist kind of reincarnate, all those different kind of ideas that are certainly not traditional Christian and certainly not super rational or scientific in that sense. And I think that it would be a really interesting area of further research, because I think when you have a question like that means so many different things to different people, it's an indicator of something. It's certainly a willingness to embrace something beyond, something unknown, a belief in something, you know, bigger than ourselves and what is here now often. But I think that in order to really understand what it means to people, it would be much more helpful to kind of, you know, separate out all those different options a little bit. It might be also something that we could do qualitatively to really understand what people mean when they say these things, because I think also for a lot of people it's a combination of things. I think some people, you know, hold a few of those aspects simultaneously. When it comes to socialization into spirituality, yes, definitely childhood, but I think also that there's something about the way society talks about these things that is maybe a little bit different to religion. So there's the kind of antipathy that is felt, or you know, kind of about religion, and that it's not, you know, sort of acceptable to talk in those terms or those kind of things. I don't know if the same thing is true of spirituality. So I think, for instance, there's some really interesting work around kind of memorializing the dead and spirituality, and the way people talk about that, the way people talk about children that they've lost, bereavement, those kind of bereavements. There's like a whole new language of spirituality has developed around that. Very much kind of in the online world, you can see it. There's kind of a whole set of terminology and the way people speak and images that they use and those kind of things that developed, which I think is not from childhood, right? That's like a new language that people have come up with to deal with bereavement. That is a language of spirituality that has become used in certain circles. So I think there are kind of a few different sources of these kind of ideas, and I think it's interesting to see. I think they have their roots maybe in something more traditional, but they get translated into a slightly different version of things that people kind of create slightly new understandings of what spirituality means in this context.
That was great. Thank you both for the question and the answer. Conrad, please go ahead.
Thank you. Nadia, this was excellent, as always. Thank you very much. I want to invite you to answer the so what question for society. And the longer version of that question is that you've compellingly showed that in what David Vos has called a secular transition, there is this phenomenon of religious residue that I think is like the phenomenon of having a lot of people of working age in the demographic transition who don't have a lot of children to raise. And so there's a potential for good that those young people could fuel the economy and provide massive economic growth in the country. Or if there aren't jobs, they could riot and be unemployed and cause all kinds of social problems. And so do you think that all this religious residue is going to be maybe bad because in Europe, for example, you have the kind of prejudice and anti-immigrant views that are more common among religious people? Or do you see more good because of giving and volunteering and whatnot? Like, so what does it mean for society if there's a lot of religious residue at this time in the secular transition?
Right. That's a really big question. I've looked into it a little bit because I thought, you know, once I've kind of looked at religious residue as it pertains to religiosity, maybe, you know, I mentioned kind of voting behaviors, and there are other things where we see this residue persist. So I did have a little bit of a look on how it affects attitudes towards minority groups. And I found some really interesting findings. So when it comes to homophobia, the big distinction is between Christians and nuns. It's less significant, whether one's a disaffiliate or a lifelong nun. They tend to hold kind of similar views. However, when it comes to attitudes towards immigrants and some other minority groups, religious minority groups, so Jews, Muslims, that sort of thing, actually disaffiliates, or being a disaffiliate is associated with a higher level of tolerance. Being a lifelong nun and a Christian is associated with more prejudice. And trying to untangle that is a bit of a puzzle. Part of me thinks that there's something about the experience of having left a religion, but still having contact with people who are different, maybe, leads people to see things in a more tolerant way. So I think, there are a lot of people who are nuns who have no contact with people who are religious, very minimal contact with people who are religious. The people that they might encounter who are religious, they might not know that they are. If you have a colleague at work, you might not know, that on a Sunday they always go to church. So the people that they talk to about religion share their views maybe. And because the identity of being a nun, I think, is increasingly coalescing into an identity of its own. And we know that simply having an identity has its own impact on how you view outgroup members. So actually there's something about being a disaffiliate that maybe is associated with seeing things viewing people more positively, people who are different from you. The same way that we talk about immigrants, and immigrants, we say, sometimes have this kind of perspective also. So I think there's something to that. But I also wonder if there are, so when we talk about religion and its impact on, volunteering or, attitudes to minorities or all those kind of things, I think sometimes the research is a bit more mixed than we think. So some aspects of religion will promote this in some cases, and some aspects of religion will promote pro-sociality, and some aspects of religion will promote prejudice. I think very clearly when it comes to homophobia, there's a very clear link between religion and intolerance. And I think that, it's a very clear and understandable and theological basis for that. And that's kind of a very clear pattern. When it comes to other groups, it's a little bit harder to untangle. And sometimes we'll find that maybe, even though there's something about religion that leads to prejudice, but maybe attending church kind of mitigates that, or maybe certain things. So I think it's one of these puzzles that I haven't got to the bottom of, is the short answer to your question. But I think it's super complex and it needs to be unraveled and it needs to be teased out. And certainly, with what we're seeing in Europe and the rise of the far right and all that, that's kind of not what I would have expected given the trends in religion and the move away from religion, because I had assumed that, that kind of intolerance was very much associated with religion in a way that we see in Ukraine and Russia playing out at the moment. So I think it's context dependent. I think it's complicated. And I think it's something we need to try and figure out because it's having a huge impact.
Thank you.
Thanks for that, Nadia. Peter, please go ahead.
Thanks, Nadia. I'll repeat with the two previous askers that research I've been involved very much goes in the same direction. In fact, I was writing up a qualitative interview this morning that all sorts of the themes came up that you discussed, obviously in much more complex ways, because at the level of the particular, everything gets really messy. There are two things. One is kind of repeating, actually three, what Conrad just said, and that is, it seems to me that your entire analysis it dovetails very, very nicely, especially with David Voss's fuzzy fidelity thesis, because you have these crossing lines on your graph, and it reminds me of his crossing lines as well. And I also I thank you for picking out the German exception, right? And that's my second question. Yeah, I remember you reported this research on lifelong disaffiliates and prejudice, anti-immigrant prejudice, stuff like that. I think you reported something like that at the last NSRN conference last year. And there, I didn't get you to ask you this question, so I'm going to ask it to you now. In that sample where you found that, did you control for the East Germans? Because that's that whole AfD phenomenon is so much stronger in East Germany than it is in West Germany, and that particular party is well, shall we say, rabidly anti-immigrant, And so I wondered what the sample without those East Germans, I know we had several samples, whether the difference that you found between affiliates and lifelong disaffiliates and lifelong nuns, or lifelong disaffiliates, I guess, lifelong nuns, was as strong or somehow a change with that control. And then the last question is actually almost a suggestion. It has to do with other research that I've done before, and that is your choice of life after death as your spirituality measure. I can understand that, and I understand your rationale. It gets at the question of what counts as, right? At what point do we have to admit, I'm sorry, there's nothing left, right? But people don't lead meaningless lives or anything like that. That's what the non-religious complex future project is all about, that positive content stuff. And in some of the research that I've done before, I had this suggestion that kind of pointed at to use a different measure and a complex one. I don't know whether the ISSP or any of these data sets would even allow you to do this, but it's a desideratum. One is, rather than using life after death, use souls. I found that among what I call them the R12s, the really non-religious people, to be the stickiest belief, right? And in that regard, finding some way to link belief in souls with belief in mind, because those, I'll give you an example. This qualitative interview I was in, I had this one quite Catholic fellow who had individualized and all that kind of stuff. And one of the things he said was that with life after death and the survival of the soul, he said that's actually a mind phenomenon in the minds of the people who survive, right? So it's remembrance rather than some sort of existence, which gets at your complexity of belief in life after death thing. So I thought maybe that if we went in that kind of direction, that might be as I say, I don't know whether there's any measure of that. That might be a way to get a little bit closer to that line, where on one side you can argue it counts as, and the other side it isn't.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting suggestion. So you and Sarah are both coming at this from this kind of, how do we drill down into these things? And I think it's really important. Although, as your example shows, I don't think the ISSP had a question about a soul, but even as your example shows, so what is it, belief in a soul? What is belief in a mind? Oh, it's made, for some people, it's memory. For some people, it's a soul. These things get, like you said, super messy when you get down to the individual level. But I think you're right. I think it would be great to have questions that really get to the nuance of these kind of beliefs. Okay. When it comes to Germany, East Germany, West Germany, and tolerance, the picture gets quite complicated. So in Germany, it turns out that relative to other countries, Christians show up as pretty tolerant compared to nuns. It's a kind of a different relationship than we see in other countries, but a lot of that is because you have a lot more Christians in Western Germany than in what was East Germany. And so a lot of the distinction there is a kind of East European, West European distinction, a post-communist versus a not post-communist cultural context, and the way that others are viewed in those cultural contexts. So that really muddies the waters. I did look at the data trying to split the two, and I ran into problems of not having enough cases. So also in this one, I kind of looked at it, but I didn't really publish it, because then you get the number of cases gets really small. If I'm only looking at West Germany and I want to see nuns back in 1998, I'm not going to have a lot. So I think there's something really interesting going on there. I think that it needs to be acknowledged and understood, because there's a hugely different, if we think the religious context is different, it completely is, but the attitude context is also completely different. Altogether, when I look at Europe and I look at, well, what's interesting is when I start getting into the post-Soviet states, sometimes my example of religious change isn't always disaffiliates, right? Often I have large numbers of converts. And so I'm looking at the flip side of the equation when I'm interested in these things. And so I kind of get a mirror image, and it's really interesting to see how that plays out, and how they relate to different minorities differently. There's a whole other story going on. So I did kind of try and understand what was going on in Germany, but I felt that I couldn't draw very firm conclusions on this kind of East-West split, just because I felt there weren't enough cases in the data in each instance. Not to mention the fact that, you know, the data is further, I can't really work on it because it's too few cases, but also those few cases might not really be people from East or West Germany, meaning that's where they are now, but I don't know where they grew up. So I'm very nervous to draw real conclusions on these issues, because I don't think the data are clear enough.
Thank you.
Thank you for that, Nadia. Thank you, Peter. Please, Mehmet, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Nadia. I really enjoyed with your talk, and I'm also excited because I'm also working on the religious socialization and absence of religious socialization in my PhD thesis. And by the way, we also have some similar findings in Naralcan in Turkey research project, both qualitative and quantitative. It's also interesting to see that. What I understood that from you're in a kind of comparing like disaffiliates for religious who has kind of religious socialization in their childhood, and those lifelong nuns, in a way, in their childhood there is no religious socialization or absence of religious socialization. So apart from these two categories, do you think there could be a third category, which is kind of I'm kind of trying to explore, like especially we have like the fuzzy fidelity, like those who have kind of a socialization, religious socialization, but also doesn't have like a kind of a fuzzy category. Do you think there's a third category, or it's just clear cut those who have kind of a religious socialization and those families who had kind of a religion in their life, and then those who never had religion in their life? And the second question is that this religious residue, actually I was thinking, and our findings was showing us like a kind of I was calling them as traces of religion in nuns. I was thinking to formulate that way, but then I saw your concept. Do you think it is because these traces or this residue is because of only religious socialization these nuns has, or this affiliate has in their childhood? Also, it's also because of the atmosphere they are living, the society they are living, and because of that, they culturally still have these traces of religion in their everyday life or in their in the society.
Okay, so it's so nice to hear that you're working in the same things. Yes, so the question of more categories, I think it's really interesting. Certainly the people who are missing from this are Christians, and you can divide them into kind of active Christians and nominal Christians, and people who aren't Christian or no religion. That also missing from this analysis. There just aren't enough cases to look at them. So I think you can certainly keep dividing, and I think, you know, those divisions are important. I think that sometimes it's easy to draw distinctions, certainly where you're using these kind of large data sets and it's questionnaires developed by other people. So if they have, you know, questions on current identity and childhood identity, then that's really helpful. But like I said, I did try to account for the fact that not all childhood socialization is the same by introducing that indicator of kind of childhood religiosity. So how often did you attend church when you were kind of 11 or 12? And the assumption is that that more reflects parental influence, right? If we would look at, you know, 15, 16, that might be kind of a different story already. But the idea is, you know, I am trying to control, because like you say, it's not such a binary distinction, right? Some people are brought up in very kind of culturally Christian or kind of, you know, nominal Christian kind of homes, and some people are brought up in really religious homes. What's interesting in the data is, I think part of the reason that you see this decline of religiosity in disaffiliates over time, part of that is, like you say, you know, the home. So we can see, you know, the people who were from earlier cohorts were raised, tends to be in more religious homes. And so that kind of controls for quite a lot of the difference. But I think part of the decline in religiosity in disaffiliates is not just the home, but it's society in general. So if you grew up a nominal Christian in the 1950s, or if you grew up a nominal Christian in the 1980s, that's an entirely different kind of experience, right? Your average kind of, oh yeah, I'm Christian, would live a different religious life. Your day, your week, your assumptions would be punctuated by completely different behaviors and attitudes. if you are kind of not particularly religious, or, you know, within the spectrum of Christian, not particularly religious Christian in those very different decades. And I think, you know, the people who are being raised now also we're seeing different thing, although, like, as Sarah's pointed out, maybe we've got a remaining core. So maybe we have, you know, of those who've remained, maybe it's a different picture. But when, you know, the majority of the population was Christian, it meant quite a different thing in different decades. And I think that, as the case of Germany shows, it's not just about parents, it's about grandparents, it's about society, it's about peers, it's about schools, it's about places of worship. So, you know, when the norms in a society shift, things change tremendously. And part of me wonders if at some point we'll end up with, well, it'll be interesting to see, right? But we could get to a point where being a non is the norm, and you have all these people who, well, it'll be interesting to see what happens, right, when that happens. So is it going to be that Christians are going to be this very small, very religious group, and they're going to be kind of a fringe thing, and then the norm will be to have no, like, we don't really know. But I think, as you say, the family is really important, but it's not the only place. But I think, so for instance, you can see very religious Christians having to nowadays develop places where they can support the socialization they give at home, right? So they actively seek out camps and schools and programs, because they feel very much they're in a minority, and it needs to be really buttressed, right? They don't feel that they're getting what their kind of Christianity, this very religious Christianity that involves, you know, certainly in many European countries, I don't know if in America we're quite there yet, but in a lot of European countries, you'll find people kind of really actively working to bolster that version of, you know, that type of Christianity that, you know, it was just not considered necessary decades ago. So I think that really speaks to the importance of peer groups and society and those kind of things as well. So I think they very much come through.
Okay, thanks so much. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for that. There is a question by Conrad, but two more questions by Conrad in the chat. First, do you plan to do more religious residue research? And then, any thoughts about how this phenomenon might work in any of the societies where the most common religion is something other than Christianity?
Yes, the first question, I do. I think there's a lot more to be understood here. And I think because so many people change their religion, it's really interesting. I've just started scratching the surface, for instance, on Eastern Europe on converts, which isn't religious residue, I guess it's maybe secularism residue, whatever. It's just, but this kind of, I think this, the fluidity of religious identity is a huge shift in the way we've thought about religion. And I think trying to understand the dynamics of what's going on helps unlock so many things, from politics to prejudice to, some people have even shown how it dictates taste, right? You know, there are certain cultural preferences and tastes that are associated with these transitions. So I think that, yes, I would like to explore more and try and understand what's going on. How this phenomenon might work in societies where the common religion is something other than Christianity. So I have looked a little bit into this so in Israel, for instance, among Jews, I've had a look at this, and it's the same mechanism very much. You see the same thing, and you see it in both directions. So I said I haven't looked yet properly at Eastern Europe. So what's interesting in Israel is it's very clear that people who were raised secular and become religious are kind of have a secular residue, with two exceptions. It seems, well, like other things that I looked at. So the exceptions seem to be things that are to do with knowledge. Yeah, they both seem to be to do with knowledge. So they're more likely, for instance, to be involved in a religious study framework, and they're more likely to consult a rabbi. And that seems to be very much tied to their newcomer status. I've also had a little look in the Israeli Jewish context about how people perceive people who have a residue. So I think this very much, it helps to kind of bring an immigration perspective into this. So there's some really interesting data on people who've shifted within Judaism, because in Israeli Judaism, the distinctions between the religious and the more religious and the less religious are really big. They have really big social significance. People dress differently, talk differently, live in different areas, have different cultures. It's really like a very clear societal, everybody knows, everybody can kind of identify people pretty quickly where they fall. Politically, it's massive. So it's a really big distinction in Israel. And so one of the data sets that I've been looking at recently looks at how people who, okay, so it's people who've become religious, the children of people who've become religious, and then how people who've always been religious perceive the shift. And so there's a real difference there. So the first generation religious kind of have very low expectations, I guess, of how the society would welcome them. And they kind of think everything's great. Second generation are kind of looking at it. It's a bit like second generation immigrants. And they say, well, hang on a minute, it's not so perfect. And interestingly, the people who've always been religious look at it and say, oh gosh, it's really hard for these people who are new to this. Poor them, it must be really difficult. Something a bit like that. So there's a lot more to unpack here, definitely. And hopefully I'll keep on working on this.
That was great, thank you. Bharathi, please go ahead.
Yeah, hi, Nadia. The work was really interesting, and it's good to see, what happens in Christian nations and mainly in mainland Europe. My question is regarding the role of nation states. Since you covered mostly European nations, and then in these nation states, where secularism is the official policy, and in certain cases like France, where there is popularly termed as secular fundamentalism. Let's not go there, but here state directs what is secular and what is religious in this particular sense. And in majority of these states, the majoritarian culture, majoritarian religion becomes the culture which is secularized. And when such cultural marks are displayed, it just appears culture, whereas the minority religion's cultural mark is seen as religion. In this particular context, when we take nuns particularly you have concentrated on Christian nuns, and there might be other nuns also, like Hindu nuns, Muslim nuns, and others. Their practices and cultural marks would seem more religious when we do not take nation state into account and policies of nation state into account. So how do you account for the variable of nation state in this? This follows from Mehmet's question about culture and religion. And also another distinction that Rennie Thomas introduces in his work on Indian scientists. Now, how do we understand this particular issue? That's it.
Gosh, you raise a lot of really interesting points. I think the context makes a huge difference, like you say. I think your point about seeming more religious was really interesting. Like religious minorities look like, they're doing religion while other people don't. I think also there's something that maybe among religious minorities in Europe, maybe there's something that buttresses their, something about being a minority and the prejudice they face that really bolsters their religious identity. So it's kind of a double barrier, maybe, that it's hard to leave. So there's the sense that if you leave your religion, you're also simultaneously somehow leaving some of your heritage or your ancestry or your ethnicity behind. And so people in those groups are much less likely to disaffiliate, for instance. And then what we're seeing also is that when in some of these groups, people who, for instance, have disaffiliated from minority religions, and then they encounter prejudice. And then that's really interesting. So in some cases, there's some qualitative research that shows that these things really, it's a very complex interplay, and that it's a completely different story. And there are many other factors at play, and people experience it very differently. And so I think there's some really interesting work to be done on them.
Great. I think we have time for one last question. There is a question by Alexander in the chat. Thank you, Nadia. What do you choose to use the term disaffiliates? People who switch to football, to liberal Christianity, or from Islam to Christianity or to Buddhism, etc., may also fall under this category. Is there a better term that could describe those who reject supernatural elements after holding them for a long time?
Right. I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to refine what I'm saying here. So I'm using the term disaffiliate to mean people who've left organized religion and have become unaffiliated, right? So we call them noms, people who have no religion. I think I would describe the shift from Islam to Christianity or Buddhism as conversion. And I think I would describe the switch from fundamental to liberal Christianity maybe as denominational switching or something like that. So I think we can use different terms in these things. I also should mention at this point that religious residue, as I say in the article, is not my term. It's Van Tongeren and de Waal and their colleagues, and I think it's building on the idea of religious residual, which is the term Helen Ebor used. So this isn't something I've come up with. I should mention that very clearly. So I think there are different kinds of religious change. Interestingly, in all the cases that I've looked at, so that's denominational change in America, I've looked at conversion in America, disaffiliation in Europe, disaffiliation in America, I think. There's this it's the same sort of pattern. It seems that this pattern is repeating. Obviously, the world is a very big place, and it could be in some countries and some cultures and some religions. This isn't what's happening. The cases I've looked at, this seems to be the mechanism. But we've talked a lot about the importance of cultural context. So I can only speak to the places that I've really looked at. Is there a better term that could describe those who reject supernatural assumptions after holding them for a long time? Maybe we need to come up with one. I don't know. We have to think about that one. I think maybe that you've identified something that maybe, or maybe one of my colleagues here could say something, but maybe there isn't a term yet. And how big is that group? And do we really know? And this takes us right back to the questions of how do we measure these kind of supernatural assumptions? What is the meaning attached to these supernatural assumptions, right? They can mean very different things to different people. And so how do we get down into that? I think the kind of research that comes out of a very Christian context puts a lot of emphasis on belief, and it's interesting to see, in other religions, maybe belief is not as central. So maybe that would kind of be an analogous thing, right? Loss of faith, right? There's a lot of literature on loss of faith. So maybe we could put it in that category. Maybe it's got some, maybe that kind of change that you describe has something in common with that. Maybe that would be a term we could apply. It's definitely something to think about. So a good area for us to work on.
I agree, Nadia. So I think we have of time, but it was a super interesting discussion. Thank you again, Nadia, for being here. Thanks everyone that asked questions and made comments. It was super interesting. Nathan, do you want to some announcements, or there's a lot of thanks there in the chat and messages to you, Nadia.
Yeah, can I just say, yeah, thanks again, Nadia. It was great. And that was our last Meet the Author for this semester, and it's a great way to close out. I just included 2 links in the chat for our most recent podcast of the Life Stances podcast. And I also included a link to sign up for our mailing list in case anyone is not already on it. But yeah, thanks again, everyone, for attending. And Nadia, again, thank you for the excellent presentation.
Thanks to Wada too for such a good
Yes.
job of hosting.
Thanks, Laurie. Okay, see you everyone. Bye.